kind of have wondered, have you guys ever contemplated like what I have, what it would be like to take off from Earth in a spacecraft and go up into space? You know, what an incredible journey that would be. Have you ever really thought about how incredible that would be? Well, truth is, the Bible promises that we're all going to take the most incredible journey. You know, death is going to launch us into eternity. And so the question is, what's there? And that's what Job asked. He is facing his own mortality. He's questioning his immortality, and his dealing with some really, really deep issues right here in chapter 14. So the big issue is, what happens when I die? Is death all there is? And is it the final word? Will there be consciousness, or will there be life after death? And now many people have equally have been fascinated with death for centuries, from ancient times to modern times. But there has, I think, been a kind of a resurgence of this death fascination in more recent times. As we deal with this virus, and the newscasts report to us, how many deaths due to the virus happens every day. It's always a topic in the news constantly. And so there is kind of a heightened resurgence, so to speak, in the fascination of death. There is actually a whole study developed that is called thanatology. In fact, you can actually get a degree from certain institutions, a postgraduate degree in thanatology. Thanatology is the study of death. Thanatology courses would teach you about grieving, about how to work through the stages of grief. And they would teach you about rituals that people engage in upon the death of a loved one. And they would teach you the attitudes of different people around the world, and different psychological makeups as people face death. So here's the thing. It's not just about the academic world. It's part of everybody's life. We all know that we're going to die, right? Everybody grows up and they look around and say they see enough people around them and they're dying. And so they realize, hey, that's going to be me someday. Now think for just a moment, there's a piece of real estate somewhere on this earth, 6 feet underground, and that real estate has got your name on it. Your body will be there one day, and it will be there for however long, just awaiting the resurrection. But Job asks the question, what happens when I die? What happens when I die? And here's Job's situation. He's lost it all. You guys know the story. I'm sure. We have spent 6 different messages in this past year, just kind of recapping over and over. But he's lost his health. He's lost his status. He's lost his property. all of his children are gone, and he's lost like relationship with life. And so the greatest fears that people have, Job he's living them as we read through these chapters. And so he has these few friends, and they come and they offer support, and that support like lasts about 1 week. And then after that week is over, their grieving is over. They turn into philosopher mode, and they're an accusatory mode. And so the book covers basically the conversations between Job and these three friends. Now in chapter 11, the second of Job's three friends, his name is Zophar, he throws into his 2 cents worth in, and he tells Job, why he is going through all this suffering. And so, uh, in Job chapters 12, 13, and in 14, that those chapters record Job's response to Zophar. And that's what we're going to cover. We're going to hear from Job responding back to his friends who's accused him. Now, let me warn you that we're about to read from Job and from his lips, where Job is at his lowest moment, his lowest point in his life ever. Job is venting. He's highly emotional, and he's speaking, and he feels, he's talking about what he's feeling at the moment. And let me just warn you that if you're around people like that in real life, try to become unshockable. Be a good friend. Get ready for that. Get ready for the gut-wrenching honesty that comes out of suffering people. Don't respond like, I just can't believe that you would talk to me that way or say such a thing like that. Well, they just said it, and so deal with it, and deal with it tenderly, and deal with it gently. Job's friends did not do that. Now, there's 3 principles we want to look at today. 3 points, and each point has a principle attached to it. And we want to look at Job's present condition and the question that comes out of that. And then we want to notice God's original intention. And we'll discover that's what God had in mind from the beginning. And then finally, Jesus' ultimate solution. And let me just say before we get into the text and kind of sum up a point that I want to make in all this. If there's no hereafter, then really nothing matters. That's really the logical conclusion. If death ends it all, then there's no consciousness after death, and there's no life after death. If there's no hereafter, nothing else really matters. You might as well do whatever you want, believe whatever you want, and have fun, and just because that is all there is. But if there is a hereafter, then nothing else matters. Nothing else matters as much as that. Now let's begin in chapter 14. Not with the question, but let's go back to the very beginning and look at Job's present condition. Look at the first verse. Job says, Man who is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble. Wow, that's actually melancholy. Here's Job viewing life with his narrow lens, and he's suffering. And so he looks around and he says, you know what? Life is just way too short, packed full of pain. And that's how he sees it. And he laments the brevity of life and the finality of death. Life is short. Billy Graham was speaking a number of years ago now at a university. And he gave this speech to the student body there, and he opened it up for questions and answers. And one of the students there said, Dr. Graham, what is the one thing in life that has surprised you most? And Dr. Graham immediately turned to that young man and said, it's brevity. Life is short. Now, we all discover that as we grow older, it seems as though that life kind of like it accelerates at its pace. It's not true. It really doesn't do that. It just seems that way. It's just a small matter of perceptiveness, how you see it from it. Like, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be entering my 7th decade. Now, I realize that at 70 years old, I'm probably, according to the national average of how long a person lives, at 76, or at least that's what I last heard it was. Yeah, you actually start thinking about, wow, do I have 6 years left? Or just how short, life can be. Now, fortunately, I think I'm in pretty good health, so I'll probably blow past that number, but who knows? You see, when you're 2 years old and your parents say, well, wait till next year, goodness, you might as well tell that child that you're going to wait for eternity, because like a year is like half of his life, at 2 years old, that's a long time. But when you're 70 years old, a year is just a fraction of time, a split second, 1/70th of a lifetime. But when a person is suffering, everything has changed. And this becomes more profound because a suffering person feels as though that they are fading away. They discover that they're withering, that they're weakening. And others are other people they see around them, they're just growing stronger. And life around them just, other people are doing activities that you can no longer do. And so, it just makes you acutely aware of, that part of the situation you're in. And when you're in pain, it's like gets far worse. And so this is often how they feel. Life is short and death is sure, and it's a struggle. And so that's the principle that we discover, that life can be very disappointing and filled with disillusionment. It doesn't have to be, but it can be, and Job sees it that way. Look at verse 2, as we're going to read on through here in chapter 14. He comes forth like a flower and fades away. He flees like a shadow and does not continue. And do you open your eyes on such a one and bring me to judgment with yourself? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? No one. Since his days are determined, the number of his months is with you. You have appointed his limits so that he cannot pass. Look away from him, that he may rest until, like a hired man, he finishes the day. For there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will sprout again, and then its tender shoots will not cease. Though its root may grow old in the earth, and its stump may die in the ground, yet the scent of water it will bud and bring forth branches like a plant. But a man dies and is laid away. Indeed, he breathes his last, and where is he? As water disappears from the sea, and as river becomes parched and dries up, so man lies down and does not rise. Until the heavens are no more, they will not awake or be aroused from their sleep. Now, I don't know if any of you caught the comparison in verse 7. Especially, I think that Job is saying here in verse 7, life isn't really fair. It's not, because a tree, you can cut the tree down and it'll grow back. You can cut it away right down to the stump and just give it some time and a little bit of water, and a shoot will come up from it. Isn't that amazing? Isn't it also amazing that you can take a lizard and you can cut its tail off, and 3 months later it grows its tail back? You can take an earthworm and you can cut it in half, and you right at the saddle part, and the part with the head and the vital organs is just going to bury itself in the ground, and it grows back the other half. Not so if you're a human. You can cut a person's head off and have that person can't grow another one back. And so he looks around, and he looks around at nature, and he says, boy, we are a vulnerable species. And once it's over, for us, it's all over. But there's a little bit of hope. There is a little bit of hope in his question. Look at the next 2 verses, and that's where what we're going to camp on for a while. Oh, that you would hide me in the grave, and you would conceal me until your wrath is past, and that you would appoint me to set time and remember me. And here's the question. If a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my heart service, I will wait until my change comes. You hear the hope in his voice here? Job hopes that there is life after death. He hopes that death is not the final word, but he asks the question, if a man dies, will he live again? He never gets the answer. The question is posed, but there seems to be no solution. And in the rest of the chapter, he lapses downward even further into despair. 400 years before Christ, Socrates asked a question that sounds very similar to what we just read from Job. You may remember that Socrates drank the poison hemlock and laid down to die. And as he's laying on his couch to die, his friends were gathered around him, and they looked at the aged philosopher and said, will he live again? So here's the best Socrates could come up with. I hope so. But no man can ever know. I hope so, but no man could ever know. You see, here's Job going, if a man dies, will he live again? Both Socrates and Job reveal the widespread ignorance that most people have about death. They just don't know. They'd love to know, and they'd love to have a certain kind of certainty about death. And I find lots of ignorance regarding death by many people. You know, sometimes it's a benign ignorance. Sometimes it's more profound. You know, for an example, I heard about a man who was reading the obituaries one day, and he said, I don't understand how come people always seem to die in alphabetical order. Well, that's a benign kind of ignorance. But Job's is much more profound than that. Job's was much deeper than that. And so let me tell you why this is important. Ignorance about death will create an uncertainty about life and hopelessness about future. If you don't know what's going to happen to you after you die, and if you're not ready for that, you will live in a very precarious and uncertain manner. And when death comes in the future, it makes a person very hopeless. Do you remember the little phrase tucked away in 1 Thessalonians as Paul wrote that letter to the church who had lost loved ones, to death? Paul writes, and he goes, I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow like others who have no hope. Hey, it's okay to grieve. It's okay to sorrow, but I want you to know the truth so that you don't end up hopeless, grieving like those who have no hope. So ignorance about death produces uncertainty about life and hopelessness of the future. Here's a good example. Back in the 1960s, a guru by the name of Timothy Leary, an LSD drug guru, he was a philosopher, and he became every young person's cool guru. And well, Timothy Leary was a guy who would often joke about death. And even when he was facing his own death, he would crack jokes about it. But one of his closest friends wrote this: even though he jokes about death, he is afraid of dying as any of us may be. More so because he really doesn't believe that there's anything that comes after this. So you see, ignorance about death produced uncertainty about life and hopelessness for the future. That's Job's condition. And Job's present, that's his present condition. Here's Job, he's suffering after losing everything, and his buddies come to him and they heap this guilt on him, and he goes, man, if a man dies, will he live again? Now let me take you to the second point here, and we're going to go back to verse 5 in just a moment, but we want to consider God's his original intention. You see, Job realizes that my life and your life, all of our lives, is set by God. There are certain boundaries and parameters that we can't get out of. In verse 5, he says, since his days are determined, the numbers of his months is with you. You have appointed his limits so that he cannot pass. Everybody born has limits. Everybody born is going to face the border of death, where there's no longer any, you no longer is any physical life. They die. And that is a limitation that is set and controlled only by God. But here's what you need to know. Something's happening to cause this. This is not God's original intention. God did not intend death for his creation. He originally intended life for his creation, and he originally intended that we were to live forever. But that was marred by sin, and something drastically happened. You know, there was a father who was at the beach with his children, and his 4-year-old boy discovered a dead seagull laying there on the beach, and he brought it to his dad, and he showed it to his dad, and he says, "Dad, what happened?" And his dad, to the best of his ability, answered him. He says, "Well, I guess the seagull died and went to heaven." Well, the little boy was pretty logical, and he said, "Well, why did God throw him back?" Well, something drastically happened to God's plan with this seagull, and that's what the little boy thought. Job is suffering, and he realizes something drastic has happened. This is not God's original design. The limits are now set. So here's God, the original plan from the beginning. It's in Genesis chapter 2. It says God formed man, and we're in verse 2 of chapter 2, or no, verse 7 of chapter 2. God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And God created man to be a living being. The Bible says a living being. To live and to live. But the same chapter, God set certain behavioral boundaries. And he said to man, of the trees of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in that day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. He says, have at it, Adam. Just go for it. Have a great time. Eat anything. Go anywhere. Have a blast. But don't go near that tree. And don't you dare eat anything on it. If you do, it's going to bring consequences. You'll die. And on that day, because man did it, there was an immediate separation between man and his creator spiritually, and there would eventually be a physical separation of the spirit from the body at physical death. Now, when Adam sinned, and there was that death that came on Adam, and you might say that Adam acted as the federal head of all humanity ever since. A constitutional change in our makeup so that Adam's act brought death, not just to Adam, but to everyone. To everyone. Even Paul says in Romans chapter 5, he says, when Adam sinned, Sin entered the entire human race. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. So God's intention originally was eternal life, but now death is the daily reality. You know, in the last 24 hours, 150,000 people have died on earth. And in the next 24 hours, another 150,000 people will die on earth. That's 100 every minute. Every single minute. And it's all around us. It's everywhere. It's pervasive. People are dying everywhere. And believe me, all those deaths are not contributed to COVID-19 either. Like George Bernard Shaw used to say, the statistics on death is quite impressive. Every one of one dies. It's gotten everybody so far, with maybe a couple of exceptions like Enoch or Elijah, those who have been translated into heaven. But it's appointed to everyone, every man to die once, and after this, the judgment. I looked it up in the scripture. The word death or die or dying or died, it appears 926 times. So you get my point. Humanity, including biblical history, is stained with death. It was not God's original intention, but it is now the present reality because sin marred the plan. Okay, so what's the solution? If man dies, will he live again? Death is the reality. So what's the solution? John chapter 11. John chapter 11 is the solution. It's found in Jesus Christ. A very familiar story to most of us. We will begin in verse 21 of John chapter 11. Jesus is at the funeral of his friend Lazarus, who has died. And right after he arrives, Martha comes to him, and starting with verse 21. Now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, now I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, yet he shall live. Now, if Jesus ever put out a top 10, of things that he has said, that would be definitely in the top 10 list. This is one of the greatest promises ever. Look at the next verse. Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. And so here's the question. Do you believe this? Do you believe it? Now let me just give you the setting here just a minute. Jesus was a close friend of this family, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And Lazarus was Mary and Martha's brother. Okay, so, and he's the one that has died here in the story. And he often spent time with them in Bethany, in their house. He lived in their house when he was anywhere around Jerusalem. And now Lazarus has gotten sick. And so as soon as he got sick, there's this courier. He comes with a letter or a message somehow to Jesus to let him know what has happened. And he says, your buddy is sick, so come quickly. And so the Bible tells us that Jesus deliberately waited until Lazarus was dead, and then he showed up. And you can hear the bitter disappointment in her voice, can't you? If you'd have just been here, my brother wouldn't have died. That's the voice of a sufferer. Jesus didn't rebuke her and go, hey, I can't believe you just said that to me, Martha. You believe in me? How could you? No, he didn't do that. He says, your brother will rise again. But what she is saying is this is your fault. You're late. God, you could have stopped this. Can I tell you this? God is never late. He's perfectly on time. Oh, you might be early, but he is never late. He winds his watch like differently than we wind ours. The Bible tells us in 2 Peter chapter 3, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness, but, and here's your deal, Martha, it's hard to see clearly when your eyes are filled with tears, and when you're suffering, and when you're in grief. It's hard to see clearly. So now here's the problem. Martha interpreted Jesus' love through her own circumstances. What she should have done is interpret her circumstances through Jesus' love. But she is skewed now. Her lens is clouded, and that's how she views life, much like Job. Well, Jesus shows up, makes his beautiful promise. It's the answer to Job, and Job asks, if a man dies, can he live again? And here's Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life. But there's a few things that seem kind of, to me, maybe out of place in this story. It's a little odd that they don't make perfect sense when you read it. So here's the first one. The tears seem to be out of place. Not the tears that make sense. You cry when somebody dies. But Jesus cried. His tears seem out of place. Look at me at verse 33. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? And they said, Lord, come see. Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the New Testament, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. He's crying. Why? It just kind of like seems like it's sort of out of place. He knows, doesn't he, that in a few minutes he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead? Don't you think Jesus would show up with like a Kleenex box or something and say, hey, stop crying, you guys. Watch this. I'm here now. He doesn't say that. It says Jesus wept. Why did he weep? Well, that's the question. And I think that Jesus is revealing the heart of God who cares when his people suffer. That's what's happening here. He's revealing the heart of God. Jesus said, did he not, that if you've seen me, you have seen the Father? And Jesus also is called a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. So here is a man full of sorrows entering into their sorrow. He is full of sorrows entering into their sorrow. He's weeping with just like a tender heart, a tender-hearted God that we serve. Isaiah the prophet said, in all of their distress, he too was distressed. Now, the second thing that seems to be out of place in this story is anger. Did you notice the phrase that Jesus groaned in his spirit and was troubled? Back in verse 33. Well, read on in verse 7. And some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? And Jesus again groaned in himself and came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. That little phrase, groaning in himself, it means that he was emotionally agitated. You know, and it's actually kind of a strong word. He was emotionally agitated, like intensely shaken by emotion. Well, why? Why was Jesus angry? Why was he angry at death? Well, Jesus knew that it wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't supposed to have happened. It wasn't supposed to, that's not how it was supposed to be. He knew that death was an intruder, and that wasn't God's original intention, and it's just wrong. And we all feel that way. When somebody that we love dies, we have that instinctive feeling, this is wrong. You know, I've been robbed. This isn't right. The problem is we can't do anything about it. The great news is Jesus can do something about it, and he will do something about it. The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is everlasting life. Jesus is angry at sin that causes death. Because when a person dies and they die in their sin, they're eternally separated. And you know, there's a myth here in America. You know, and I just want to touch on it for a minute. The myth says that the only thing you need to do is go to heaven, is to die. That's all you need to do. You know, I've been to a lot of different funerals, and I've listened, and especially if I know the person in life and I knew that person, you know, wasn't a Christian, never like read their Bible or went to church, you know, really could have cared less about anything spiritual. And suddenly there's a preacher, he's up there and he's trying to push that poor pagan on into heaven. Now, if this person never wanted to go to be with God ever, why would God force that person to be with him forever? But that's the myth. Just die and we'll find somebody to push you into heaven. Or just be sincere and very good and do a lot of good works. And if you die, you go to heaven. It doesn't work that way. The wages of sin is death, spiritually and physically. And Jesus was angry at sin that causes death. That's why it was like that. Now there's a third thing that seems kind of out of place to me. I don't know, but if you're ready for it, you know, Jesus not only wept, he was not only angry at the funeral, but he walks up to the grave itself as if to be right next to it. Now, that seems a little strange to me. I just want to show you this. Verse 38. Jesus, groaning himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and the stone lay against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And Martha, and the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there's a stench, for he's been dead for 4 days." And can I say to you, you cannot beat the old King James version of this. If you have one, you know what I'm talking about. By the way, Lord, he stinketh. Yeah, I like that. It's so picturesque. Take away the stone. He stinketh, Lord. So why did Jesus make a deal out of walking to the tomb? Why couldn't Jesus have been 100 yards back and done this like waved his hand, over it, and the stone just rolled away? And I mean, and then just say, "Hey, Lazarus, buddy, come on, let's get out of here. Let's go for it." And so he did that before, didn't he? Did he not heal at a distance? Did he not just speak a word on some occasion, and there was instant healing through a different location? No, Jesus is in his tears and in his anger, and he walks up to the grave where Lazarus is buried, and it's there that he conquers death by a resurrection. Because one day, that's actually what he will do to your grave and to mine. Whenever that happens to be, right here on this earth, he will conquer death by a physical resurrection that will take place at some time in the future. The reason he can do that is because he went to the cross and he conquered sin that separated us from God and enabled life through resurrection. And so here's a preview. And let's call it a preview of coming attractions. That's what's happening with Lazarus. For the believer, death is not the final word. Jesus Christ is the final word, and he made that very clear that day. Go back to verse 26 and look at the very last question. He says to those sisters, "Do you believe this?" Those are his words. He didn't just say, "I am the resurrection and the life." He didn't just say, "Whoever lives and believes in me will never die." He personalizes it. Do you believe this? Can I just say, if you believe this morning, it'll show up in how you live. If you believe this morning, then the way you face death is not with ignorance, but with eagerness. With the confidence of knowing the future, being confident in the way that you live, because there's not the same kind of hopeless grief that comes. Folks, that's why the Bible calls death going to sleep. Going to sleep. Paul wrote about those believers who go to sleep in Christ, meaning death. Go back with me to verse 11. Look at Jesus, what Jesus says to his disciples here in this chapter. These things he said. After that, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I'm going to wake him up." Now, the disciples didn't get it. It kind of like went right over the top of their head. And so they go, well, if he's going to like fall asleep, he'll wake up, So Jesus knew that they didn't quite get the analogy that he was making. And so verse 14, Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Sleep and death are the same in the Bible. And here's why. It's temporary. It's like taking a nap. I hope you all get the whole different perspective of death as nap taking. Like, hey, I know most of you aren't as old as I am, but like I have really come to enjoy my naps. It's a good thing. And so it's and it'll be, it just takes a split second. That's like it's like you take a nap and just a split second you're awake. So it'll be instant. Instantly your spirit is in the presence of God in heaven instantly. And your body will be awaiting its resurrection. But you will have no more fear of death than like taking a nap. So, death isn't the end of the road. It's just the kind of, it's in the bend of the road. And so it's the doorway that leads you to something. Glory, that's what it leads you to. It's graduation day when that happens. And so Job's question shows the uncertainty that people live with and the reason why so many people cling tenaciously to this life. They don't want to lose the life that, I want to just live just a moment longer. They want to cling to it. I've got a story for you about clinging to life. Now, I'll tell you as Anthony comes up. There were 3 guys that died and went to heaven. They died in a car crash. And they were there at orientation day in heaven. And there was Peter, right? Peter is always the guy there in these dumb jokes at orientation day. And Peter said to these 3 buddies, okay, when you're in your casket and you're in your funeral and your friends and your family are gathered around, what is the one thing that you want to hear them say? And one man says, well, I'd like to hear the people say that I was a good doctor and that I loved my family. And the second guy said, I'd like to hear them say that I was a good teacher and that I was a great husband. And the third guy, he says, I think I'd like to hear him say, look, he's moving. There's some people who just want to cling to death, to life, not knowing what's ahead. Now, I understand the resistance to do that if you're not right with God, but if you are right with God, the moment you pass from here, the day dawns and it becomes a new reality. So if I'm like ever in a deathbed type situation, and you if you dare pray for me, if you pray me back, and I'm slipping over into eternity and I'm just like right there, just please, if you do that, I'm coming after you when I get back. Yeah. Now, I'm going to hunt you down. Now, for me, life is Christ, and to die is gain. And once you pass from this life into eternity and you experience that joy that we're all waiting for, it is gain.